Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the gilded gates of the most secretive prison in history, the Ottoman Imperial Harem. You can almost hear the whisper of silk against marble floors, smell the intoxicating blend of rosewater and fear that permeated these opulent chambers. Behind walls decorated with precious gems and golden calligraphy, hundreds of women lived lives that glittered on the surface but rotted underneath like fruit left too long in the sun. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, about why power and beauty so often walked hand in hand with cruelty and despair. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below. But make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Feel free to let me know where and when you started watching this video, or perhaps share what drew you to learn about these forgotten women's lives. Your engagement helps me continue bringing these hidden stories to light. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in the court of the concubines within Topkapi Palace, Istanbul, sometime during the 16th century when the Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents. The marble beneath your bare feet feels cold despite the warming braziers, and you're wearing silk robes that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Yet you know, with a certainty that sits heavy in your chest, that you will never leave this place alive. The harem wasn't just the Sultan's private quarters, it was a city within a city housing up to 1,200 women at its peak. You're surrounded by architecture that screams wealth. Mother-of-pearl inlays catch the light from crystal chandeliers, while fountains tinkle peacefully in courtyards where you'll spend decades pacing like a caged leopard. The Ottomans spared no expense in creating this paradise, because that's exactly what they wanted it to appear to be. But you quickly learn that paradise has rules written in blood. The golden lattice work on the windows isn't just decorative, it's your first reminder that you're a prisoner. Those beautiful geometric patterns prevent you from seeing the outside world clearly, turning everything beyond into shadowy suggestions of a life you once knew. The sweet scent of jasmine that drifts through the gardens carries an undertone of something else. The musk of desperation from hundreds of women who've walked these paths before you. Historians still argue whether the harem system was designed primarily for the Sultan's pleasure or as a complex political institution. But you don't have the luxury of academic debate. You're living it, breathing it, trapped within its silk-lined walls where beauty and brutality dance together in an endless waltz. The word harem itself comes from the Arabic haram, meaning forbidden or sacred, which perfectly captures your new reality. You're both blessed and cursed, elevated and imprisoned all at once. Every woman here shares your fate, stolen from families, purchased from slave markets, or presented as diplomatic gifts like exotic birds in golden cages. You notice how the older women move with a particular grace that comes not from training but from exhaustion. Their eyes hold secrets that would make sultans tremble, and their smiles never quite reach those knowing eyes. They've learned what you're only beginning to understand, that in a place where women exist solely for one man's pleasure, survival requires becoming something both more and less than human. The architecture itself whispers warnings if you know how to listen. Those magnificent domed ceilings that should inspire awe instead feel like they're pressing down, reminding you that even the sky above belongs to someone else now. The intricate tilework tells stories of conquest and glory, but for you they might as well be counting the days until your death. Tonight, as you settle into this golden nightmare, you begin to understand why the Ottoman Empire's greatest weakness wasn't external enemies or economic collapse. It was the rot that festered in the heart of its most beautiful creation, where human souls were currency and love was a weapon more deadly than any sword. You weren't born into this fate, nobody ever was. The journey that brought you to these marble corridors began thousands of miles away, in a life that now feels like someone else's dream. Perhaps you were playing with your siblings in a village along the Black Sea coast when the raiders came. Or maybe you were sold by parents who couldn't afford another mouth to feed during a particularly brutal winter. The Ottoman machine of human acquisition had many gears, all grinding toward the same destination. You, standing here now, your past erased like footprints in sand. The devshirme system, the child levy, was the empire's most systematic method of harvesting human lives for imperial use. Every few years, Ottoman officials would sweep through Christian villages in the Balkans, selecting the most beautiful and intelligent children like farmers choosing the ripest fruit. You might have been as young as 8 when they took you, old enough to remember your mother's face, but young enough to be moulded into whatever shape the empire required. If you were fortunate enough to catch their eye for your exceptional beauty, you were marked for the harem before you even understood what that meant. The selection process was clinical in its cruelty. Officials examined your teeth like you were livestock, checked your skin for blemishes, and tested your ability to learn by teaching you simple phrases in Turkish. Those who passed this grotesque audition were branded, literally marked with hot iron, to prevent escape attempts during the long journey to Constantinople. The march to your new prison could take months, depending on where the slavers found you. You travelled in caravans with dozens of other stolen children, chained together at the ankles to prevent anyone from running toward the mountains that grew smaller each day behind you. The traders fed you just enough to keep you alive, but not enough to give you strength for rebellion. Many children didn't survive the journey, their small bodies left beside roads that had already witnessed thousands of similar tragedies. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman slave trade was more humane than other systems, because slaves could theoretically rise to positions of power. But you know the academic debates mean nothing when you're watching a younger girl collapse from exhaustion and never get up again. Some of you arrived through different channels. The gift economy that connected Ottoman sultans with rulers across Europe and Asia. A desperate king might send his most beautiful daughter as tribute to secure peace, wrapping her in silk and calling her an ambassador of goodwill. These diplomatic presents understood their fate better than the kidnapped children, which somehow made their journey even more heartbreaking. The really twisted aspect was how some families began volunteering their daughters, hoping that life in the Imperial Harem might offer better prospects than poverty in their villages. These mothers convinced themselves they were giving their children opportunities, not realizing they were feeding their babies to a machine that consumed innocence as fuel for imperial pleasure. Once you reached Constantinople, the final sorting began at the slave markets near the Grand Bazaar. Merchants specializing in human cargo examined you like you were a prize horse, checking your reflexes, testing your voice, and making you perform simple tasks to demonstrate your trainability. The most beautiful girls commanded prices that could buy entire houses, while those deemed less desirable were sold for domestic service. A fate that seemed cruel until you learned what awaited the lucky ones. The moment you entered Topkapi Palace, your old name died. From now on, you would be called by whatever name the palace officials chose, usually something describing your physical features or origin. Gulna, flower of the pomegranate. Miriban, kind son, or simply Circassian or Georgian, to mark where they stole you from. Your identity became whatever the Ottoman Empire decided it should be. The final cruelty of your acquisition was perhaps the most psychologically devastating. They gave you hope. Palace officials explained that you were chosen for great honours, that you might become the mother of princes, that your beauty and intelligence had elevated you above common fate. They taught you to feel grateful for your captivity, to see your kidnapping as salvation rather than destruction. As you settle into your first night behind these walls, you realize that your journey here wasn't just about geography. It was about the systematic erasure of who you used to be, preparing the blank canvas that the harem would paint with its own twisted artistry. You wake to the sound of a silver bell, delicate as morning rain but commanding as thunder. Your education begins before dawn breaks over the Bosphorus, and it will continue relentlessly for years until every trace of the girl you once were has been carefully sculpted away. The Ottoman Harem wasn't just a collection of beautiful women, it was a finishing school for human dolls, designed to create creatures so perfectly crafted for imperial pleasure that they barely qualified as human anymore. Your teachers are older women who survived their own transformations decades ago, their faces masks of patience hiding whatever storms still rage in their souls. They speak to you in Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, switching languages mid-sentence to force your brain to adapt. Forget your mother tongue, they tell you gently but firmly. It belongs to a dead girl. Within months, you find yourself thinking in Ottoman Turkish, your childhood lullabies fading like echoes in an empty room. The physical training begins with posture hours spent balancing books on your head while walking across marble floors. Your spine must be straight as a minaret, your movements fluid as silk in wind. They teach you 37 different ways to bow, each one precisely calibrated for different ranks and occasions. The wrong bow to the wrong person could mean death, so you practice until muscle memory replaces conscious thought. Music becomes your second language. You learn to play the oud with fingers that must remain soft as rose petals, your calluses carefully managed with pumice stones and almond oil. The palace demands perfection in performance, not just technical skill, but the ability to convey emotion through melody. The Sultan must see his own desires reflected in your music, instructs your teacher, a woman whose eyes suggest she once made that same music for a man who's now decades dead. Poetry lessons stretch deep into the night. You memorize thousands of verses in multiple languages, learning to recite love poems with just the right combination of innocence and suggestion. The most valued concubines could compose original verses on command, weaving the Sultan's name into metaphors about gardens, nightingales, and burning candles. You discover that your brain, once used for simple village calculations, now stores elaborate fantasies designed to inflame male imagination. Dancing transforms your body into a living artwork. Every gesture carries meaning. The angle of your wrist, the tilt of your head, the rhythm of your breathing. You learn dances from across the empire, the sensual hip movements of Egyptian courtesans, the delicate hand gestures of Persian tradition, the wild spinning of Sufi mystics adapted for imperial entertainment. Your teachers critique every movement until you can seduce without seeming to try, appearing innocent while performing acts that would scandalize the women you once knew. Historians still argue whether harem education was surprisingly comprehensive or deliberately limiting, but you experience both simultaneously. Your mind expanded in some directions while being systematically destroyed in others. The strangest lessons involve conversation. You must learn to be fascinating without being threatening, intelligent without appearing too clever, amusing without overstepping boundaries that shift like sand dunes in wind. Mock conversations with eunuch tutors teach you to laugh at exactly the right moment, to ask questions that make men feel wise, to disagree in ways that seem like flirtation rather than opposition. Beauty maintenance consumes hours daily. Your skin is scrubbed with silk gloves until it glows like marble, then oiled with mixtures that cost more than most families earn annually. Every hair below your eyebrows must be removed with painful precision. Your teeth are cleaned with rose powder, your breath sweetened with rare spices. Even your sweat is managed. Special diets ensure your bodily scents remain pleasant, while perfumed baths leave lingering traces of jasmine and ambergris. The psychological conditioning might be the most insidious aspect of your training. Gradually, subtly, they teach you to compete with other women rather than sympathize with them. Every compliment you receive comes paired with criticism of someone else's performance. You learn to measure your worth through male attention, to see other concubines as obstacles rather than allies in shared captivity. Language itself becomes a prison. You're taught euphemisms that transform brutal realities into flowery poetry. Sexual submission becomes the sweet surrender of the rose to morning dew. Your captivity transforms into the honoured seclusion of imperial favour. Even rape gets repackaged as receiving the Sultan's blessed attention. By the time your training nears completion, you barely recognise the girl who entered these walls. You move like liquid music, speak like honeyed poetry, and think in terms of pleasing someone whose face you've never seen. The Empire has created exactly what it wanted. A beautiful ghost-haunting silk robes perfectly trained to love her own destruction. You discover that hell has its own social ladder, and you're starting at the very bottom. The harem hierarchy rises like a twisted pyramid above you, each level representing another woman's dreams crushed or ambitions realized through others' suffering. As a new odalisk, literally meaning chamber girl, you occupy the lowest rung, invisible to those above except when they need someone to blame for their own frustrations. The pyramid's base teems with hundreds of women just like you, recently trained, desperately hopeful, and completely expendable. You sleep in dormitories with dozens of other odalisks, your narrow bed one among many, in rooms that echo with whispered prayers in languages the Empire tried to make you forget. The competition begins immediately, for better sleeping spots, cleaner water for washing, even scraps of attention from the women above who might lift you from obscurity. Above you hover the Gözde, the favourites, who've caught the Sultan's eye at least once. They wear better clothes, eat superior food, and carry themselves with the dangerous confidence of women who've tasted power and found it intoxicating. You watch them glide through corridors like beautiful sharks, their smiles sharp with secrets you're not worthy to hear. Some Guzda have waited decades for a second invitation to the imperial bedchamber, their youth fading as they cling to memories of one night when they mattered. The Iqbal occupy a higher sphere entirely, women who've been intimate with the Sultan multiple times and live in constant hope of pregnancy. Their quarters are luxurious apartments rather than shared dormitories, their servants chosen from the ranks of odalisks like yourself. An Iqbal might command dozens of women, wielding authority over lives while remaining powerless over her own fate. You serve them, knowing that their cruelty toward you stems from their own desperate fear of falling back into obscurity. At the pyramid's peak sits the Kadin Effendi, the official consorts who've borne the Sultan children. These women live like queens in miniature palaces within the harem, their every whim attended by armies of servants. They dress in robes worth small kingdoms, their jewellery collected from conquered territories across 3 continents. Yet even they live in terror, because producing a son means nothing if that son dies young or loses the succession struggle that will inevitably come. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, rules this feminine empire with absolute authority. She alone can order executions, arrange marriages, or elevate an odalisk to Kadin status. When she passes through the harem, grown women who command provinces prostrate themselves like children. Her word becomes law because she represents the only power that matters, influence over the man who owns everyone else. Historians still argue whether the harem hierarchy provided opportunities for social mobility or simply created more elaborate forms of oppression. But you experience it as both. A ladder you might climb by stepping on other women's faces. The ranking system extends to absurd details that consume your daily existence. Your clothing indicates your status. Odalisks wear simple silk, while higher ranks display increasingly elaborate fabrics and jewels. The colours you're allowed to wear, the patterns on your scarves, even the style of your slippers announce your place in the pecking order. You learn to read these signals instantly, knowing that approaching someone above your station inappropriately could result in punishment or worse. Mealtimes become exercises in humiliation. You eat what the higher-ranked women leave behind, often standing while they recline on silk cushions. The quality of your food reflects your worth. Plain rice and vegetables, while Iqbal enjoy delicacies imported from across the empire. You develop a hunger that's not just physical but spiritual. starving for the recognition that might elevate you to better tables. Your living space shrinks or expands based on your ranking. As an odalisque, you own nothing beyond the clothes assigned to you and perhaps a small mirror or comb. Higher-ranked women accumulate possessions like armor against uncertainty, Persian carpets, Chinese porcelain, European clocks that mark time they can't control. The ultimate irony is that material wealth increases as personal freedom disappears entirely. The most twisted aspect of this hierarchy is how it makes you complicit in your own oppression. You find yourself hoping for other women's failures, celebrating when competitors fall from grace, measuring your worth through their suffering. The system transforms potential allies into enemies, ensuring that rebellion becomes impossible when everyone's too busy climbing over each other to consider escaping together. Even friendship becomes dangerous in this vertical world. Getting too close to someone below your rank suggests you're not ambitious enough, while befriending someone above marks you as presumptuous. You learn to maintain careful distances, offering just enough warmth to avoid being seen as cold, while never revealing vulnerabilities that might be used against you. As you lie on your narrow bed tonight, surrounded by dozens of other breathing, dreaming, desperate women, you realize that the hierarchy isn't just organizational structure, it's the harem's immune system, designed to prevent the solidarity that might threaten the entire institution. You live for a glance that might never come, preparing every day for a moment that should transform your existence or confirm your irrelevance forever. The Sultan moves through the harem like a distant storm. His presence felt long before he arrives, his absence lingering like perfume in empty rooms. Every woman here orbits around this invisible sun, their entire universe defined by his gravitational pull, yet most will never get close enough to feel his warmth. The mechanics of imperial attention are as choreographed as court ballet. When the Sultan decides to visit the harem, eunuchs announce his intention hours beforehand, sending waves of panic and preparation through the women's quarters. You join the frantic beautification ritual, hundreds of women simultaneously perfecting their appearance for a man who might look at 3 or 4 of them at most. The competition transforms the harem into a marketplace of desperation, each woman hawking her youth, beauty and carefully cultivated charm. Your heart pounds as you line up with the other odalisques in the court of the concubines, arranged by height and perceived beauty like living flowers in a human bouquet. The Sultan enters surrounded by his eunuch guards, his robes rustling with the sound of silk and power. You keep your eyes downcast as trained, but steal glimpses of this man who holds the power of life and death over you. Sometimes he's younger than you expected, sometimes older, but always moving with the careful deliberation of someone who knows the entire world, waits for his smallest gesture. He might pause before a woman who catches his eye, perhaps touching her chin to lift her face toward his. The chosen few are marked with a silk handkerchief, a token that means tonight they'll be bathed in rosewater, dressed in the finest garments, and escorted to chambers you've only heard described in whispers. For everyone else, it's another day of invisible existence, another night of wondering if beauty fades faster than hope dies. The selection process reveals the arbitrary nature of imperial desire. A woman who's been ignored for months might suddenly become his obsession, while former favourites watch in horror as their star falls without warning. Sometimes his choices seem random. The girl with an unusual laugh, the one who reminds him of someone from his childhood, the concubine who accidentally dropped her handkerchief at exactly the right moment. You learn that in a world where everything depends on one man's whims, logic becomes your enemy and luck your only prayer. The chosen woman's preparation becomes theatre for everyone else's torment. You might spend hours helping to dress a rival for her moment of triumph, braiding her hair with fingers that shake with envy, painting her lips while imagining them pressed against the mouth that could elevate your own status. The selected concubine tries to appear gracious about her fortune, while terror and excitement war in her eyes. She knows that tonight could make her dreams come true, or destroy her entirely if she fails to please. Historians still argue whether the Sultan's selections were truly random or influenced by complex political calculations involving the women's backgrounds and potential offspring, but from your perspective, it feels like divine caprice dispensed by an earthly god. The waiting becomes its own form of torture. You might spend years perfecting your appearance and conversation skills for an audience that never materializes. Some women develop elaborate superstitions, wearing certain colors, standing in specific positions, or reciting particular prayers that they believe increase their chances of selection. Others descend into despair, their beauty wilting like flowers without sunlight, as they realize their youth is disappearing in service of a fantasy. The psychological warfare among the women intensifies around selection times. Sabotage becomes an art form. A rival might accidentally spill oil on your best dress, or spread rumours about your health, or even slip substances into your food that would make you appear sickly during inspection. You learn to guard your possessions and watch your back, never knowing which friendly face might belong to someone plotting your downfall. The cruelest aspect is how hope and despair dance together in your daily existence. Each new day brings the possibility of selection, keeping you invested in a system designed to consume you. You find yourself grateful for scraps of attention from a man who owned you like furniture, measuring your worth through his momentary interest rather than any internal value. Even rejection becomes complicated in this twisted dynamic. Not being chosen feels like personal failure, as if your worth as a human being has been officially measured and found lacking. The Empire has trained you so thoroughly that you blame yourself for the Sultan's disinterest rather than questioning why your entire existence should depend on one person's sexual preferences. As you return to your narrow bed after another day of not being seen, you realize that the Sultan's power isn't just political or military. It's the ability to make hundreds of intelligent, beautiful women compete for the privilege of being consumed by someone who will never truly see them as human beings, rather than objects for his pleasure. You discover that your womb becomes both your greatest weapon and your most dangerous vulnerability the moment you suspect new life growing inside you. In the harem, pregnancy isn't just a biological condition. It's a political revolution that could elevate you to unprecedented power, or mark you for assassination before your child draws its first breath. The morning you wake feeling nauseous, your world shifts on its axis, and every woman around you suddenly becomes either a potential ally or a mortal enemy. The early signs must be hidden at all costs while you confirm your condition. You learn to vomit silently, to mask the telltale pallor with carefully applied cosmetics, to continue dancing and singing while your body rebels against every movement. Discovery too early could trigger a miscarriage, either natural from the stress or deliberately induced by rivals who understand that your pregnancy threatens their own children's future. The harem's physicians are skilled in herbs that end pregnancies as quietly as shadows, and accidents become remarkably common when succession hangs in the balance. Once your condition becomes undeniable, your status transforms overnight. Suddenly you're moved to better quarters, assigned personal servants, and fed delicacies designed to nourish the precious cargo in your belly. But this elevation comes with invisible shackles that bind you more tightly than any chains. You're no longer just responsible for your own survival. The life growing inside you represents potential imperial succession, making you a target for every other mother in the harem who dreams of seeing her own son on the throne. The gender of your unborn child becomes an obsession that consumes everyone around you. Sons mean power, inheritance, and the possibility of becoming Valide Sultan if your boy survives to rule. Daughters are beautiful disappointments, cherished but politically worthless, destined for arranged marriages that serve imperial diplomacy rather than maternal ambition. Court physicians examine you with techniques that seem more like witchcraft than medicine, reading signs in your posture, skin colour and food cravings, to predict whether you carry a prince or princess. Your pregnancy becomes public property, monitored by eunuchs who report every detail to the Valide Sultan. Your diet is controlled, your exercise regulated, your emotional state managed like a delicate garden that must produce perfect fruit. Privacy becomes a memory as servants watch your every move, ensuring you don't endanger the imperial investment growing in your womb. The child isn't yours, it belongs to the empire from the moment of conception. The psychological warfare intensifies as other pregnant women become your direct competitors. You form uneasy alliances with mothers whose children pose no immediate threat, while secretly plotting against those carrying potential rivals to your own offspring's future. Historians still argue whether harem mothers genuinely love their children or simply use them as vehicles for personal ambition, but you experience both emotions simultaneously. Fierce maternal protectiveness twisted together with calculating political awareness. The birth itself becomes a state event, witnessed by officials who must verify the child's legitimacy and gender. You labour surrounded by strangers whose primary concern isn't your health, but the successful delivery of imperial property. The moment your baby emerges, its fate is already being decided by people who see it as a chess piece rather than your child. Sons are celebrated with elaborate ceremonies while daughters receive polite acknowledgement and careful calculation of their future marriage value. If you're fortunate enough to deliver a healthy son, your elevation to Kadin Effendi status brings unprecedented privileges and proportional dangers. Your child becomes a target for every other mother's son, because Ottoman succession traditionally involved eliminating potential rivals through strangulation with silk bowstrings, a method that left no visible marks on royal corpses. You learn to taste your child's food before he eats, to check his toys for hidden weapons, to trust no one completely because love and murder often wear the same face in the harem. The twisted mathematics of imperial motherhood become your daily reality. The more sons you bear, the greater your power, and the more desperate your rivals become. Each pregnancy is a gamble with death. Childbirth mortality rates in the harem were staggering, despite access to the empire's best physicians. But surviving birth only begins the longer struggle of keeping your children alive long enough to matter. Your relationship with your children becomes complicated by the system that uses them as currency. You love them with the fierce desperation of a mother who knows they could be murdered at any moment, but you must also train them to be weapons in a war they didn't choose. Sons learn early that their brothers are competitors for survival, while daughters understand their value lies entirely in their future reproductive potential. As you hold your newborn tonight, feeling the tiny heartbeat against your chest, you realize that pregnancy in the harem isn't about creating new life. It's about manufacturing the ammunition for wars that will be fought long after you're gone, using your children's blood as ink to write the empire's future. You witness the transformation of mothers into monsters, where maternal love becomes a weapon sharp enough to cut throats and poison minds. In the harem, motherhood doesn't soften women, it turns them into calculating predators who measure their success in other children's corpses. The sweet lullabies you once sang to your own babies now carry undertones of menace, because every other infant represents a potential threat to your child's survival and your own future power. The mathematics of succession create an impossible equation that can only be solved through elimination. When the Sultan dies, tradition dictates that his successor must remove all potential rivals to prevent civil war. This means that only one prince can live to inherit the throne, while all his brothers must die. As a mother, you face a horrifying choice: ensure your son kills his siblings, or watch him be killed by theirs. There's no middle ground in the Ottoman system, no possibility of sharing power or peaceful coexistence. You learn to read the signs of impending fratricide in the subtle changes around the harem. When the Sultan's health begins failing, mothers start moving like pieces on a chessboard, forming alliances that will dissolve the moment their interests conflict. The woman who helped you through difficult childbirth might slip poison into your son's milk if his existence threatens her boy's claim to power. Trust becomes a luxury you can't afford when your child's life hangs in the balance. The actual murders are carried out with ceremonial precision that makes them even more chilling. Royal executioners use silk bowstrings, the traditional method of eliminating Ottoman princes, because silk leaves no marks on the neck and preserves the victim's dignity even in death. You might hear the soft footsteps in corridors at night, knowing that somewhere a mother is losing a son to the political necessity of imperial succession. The silence afterwards is always worse than screaming would be. Some mothers attempt to save their sons through elaborate escape plans, smuggling children out of the palace in laundry baskets or disguising them as servants. These desperate schemes rarely succeed. The empire's intelligence network reaches across continents, and runaway princes are usually returned for execution within months. The failed escape attempts result in not only the child's death, but often the mother's as well, punishment for attempting to defy the system's brutal logic. The Valide Sultan orchestrates much of this carnage with the cold efficiency of a military commander. As the mother of the reigning Sultan, she has the power to decide which grandchildren live and which must die for the empire's stability. You watch her make these calculations with the same care she might use to plan a banquet menu, weighing political advantages against family affections and always choosing power over blood. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman system of fratricide was more or less brutal than European succession wars that devastated entire kingdoms, but you experience it as intimate terrorism where love becomes the weapon used to destroy what you love most. The psychological toll on surviving mothers creates a generation of women who've learned to weaponize their maternal instincts. They teach their daughters to view other girls as future competitors, training them in the arts of seduction and manipulation before they're old enough to understand why such skills matter. Sons receive lessons in paranoia alongside their education in statecraft, learning to suspect poison in every cup and assassination behind every smile. You discover that successful mothers often become the most ruthless administrators of death. Having secured their own sons' positions through the elimination of rivals, they turn their attention to potential future threats. A mother who's won the succession struggle might order the deaths of her own grandsons if they seem to threaten her son's rule. The system creates cycles of violence where each generation of mothers repeats the sins of their predecessors. The cruelest aspect is how the empire justifies this carnage as necessary for stability. Officials speak solemnly about preventing civil wars and protecting the realm from chaos, transforming infanticide into patriotic duty. Mothers are expected to accept their children's deaths gracefully, understanding that imperial peace requires these sacrifices. The women who resist or grieve too publicly face accusations of disloyalty to the very empire their children died to preserve. Even the surviving sons carry psychological scars from witnessing their mother's transformations. They grow up knowing that the women who sing them lullabies are also capable of ordering executions, that maternal love in the harem comes with conditions that might require their deaths. These princes often become emotionally distant rulers, unable to trust anyone completely, because their earliest lessons taught them that even mothers kill their children when politics demands it. As you tuck your own child into bed tonight, checking the shadows for dangers that might emerge before dawn, you realize that the harem hasn't just imprisoned your body, it's corrupted your soul, turning the most fundamental human bond into another tool for destruction in the empire's endless hunger for power. You live under the constant gaze of men who've been surgically stripped of their manhood, transformed into the perfect guards for an empire that trusts no one completely. The eunuchs who control every aspect of your daily existence move through the harem corridors like ghosts of masculinity. Their high-pitched voices and smooth faces constant reminders of the brutal sacrifices the Ottoman system demands from everyone it touches. These castrated men become your jailers, confessors, and sometimes your only allies in a world where natural gender roles have been twisted into something unrecognisable. The head eunuch, the Kisla Aga, wields power that rivals the Grand Viziers, controlling not just the harem but vast financial networks that span the empire. You watch him glide through his domain in silk robes worth more than entire villages, his jewelled fingers directing the fates of hundreds of women with casual gestures. His authority stems from the very mutilation that destroyed his capacity for sexual threat, making him the one man the Sultan trusts completely around his women. The irony is sharp enough to cut. The most powerful man in your world is no longer truly a man at all. These eunuchs come to their positions through childhood horrors that make your own kidnapping seem almost merciful by comparison. Most were castrated as boys in specialised centres across Africa and the Caucasus, where survival rates rarely exceeded 30%. The empire preferred eunuchs from specific regions, Africans for their loyalty, Circassians for their intelligence, Georgians for their administrative skills, turning human geography into a catalogue of specialised mutilation. Those who lived through the procedure were sold for prices that could purchase entire estates, their survival marking them as valuable commodities in the imperial machine. You learn to navigate the complex hierarchy among your guardians, each eunuch occupying a specific niche in the harem's ecosystem. Some specialise in education, teaching you languages and arts with the passionate dedication of men who've channeled their truncated sexuality into intellectual pursuits. Others focus on administration, managing the budgets and supplies that keep hundreds of women fed, clothed and entertained. The most feared eunuchs work in security, their network of informants ensuring that no secret remains hidden for long. The relationship between eunuchs and concubines creates a strange form of intimacy impossible in the outside world. These castrated men can touch you without sexual implication, helping with your clothing and cosmetics in ways that would be scandalous with intact males. You find yourself confiding in them about fears and dreams you'd never share with other women, knowing that their own damaged sexuality makes them unlikely to judge yours. Some eunuchs become almost maternal figures, their protective instincts intensified by their inability to have biological children of their own. Historians still argue whether eunuch guardians were more sympathetic to women suffering or more cruel because of their own mutilation. But you experience both extremes simultaneously in different individuals. The eunuch's surveillance extends far beyond physical observation into psychological monitoring that would impress modern intelligence services. They catalogue your friendships, noting when alliances form or dissolve among the women. Your eating habits, sleeping patterns and emotional states are all recorded in reports that help the administration predict and prevent rebellion before it can organise. The most skilled eunuch spies can detect pregnancy before the women themselves realise their condition, reading signs in posture and complexion that escape less trained observers. Some eunuchs develop elaborate fantasy lives around the women they guard, creating emotional attachments that substitute for the physical relationships their mutilation makes impossible. You might find yourself the object of a eunuch's obsessive but necessarily platonic devotion, receiving gifts and special treatment from a man whose damaged sexuality has been redirected into something between fatherly protection and romantic yearning. These relationships can provide advantages, but also dangers, as jealous eunuchs sometimes punish women who don't reciprocate their impossible affections. The most disturbing aspect of eunuch control is how they internalise the empire's values, becoming enthusiastic enforcers of a system that destroyed them. Having survived castration and risen to positions of relative power, they defend the imperial structure with the fervour of converts. They punish escape attempts and rebellions with particular cruelty, perhaps because successful defiance would force them to confront their own acceptance of mutilation and captivity. The eunuch's own living quarters reveal the contradictions of their existence. Their rooms are often decorated with feminine luxury, silk cushions, delicate artwork, expensive perfumes, as if they're trying to surround themselves with the beauty they can observe but never truly possess. Some collect books and scholarly works, channeling their frustrated energies into intellectual pursuits that might have been impossible if they'd remained whole men with families and normal desires. As you fall asleep tonight to the sound of eunuch guards making their rounds, their soft footsteps and muffled conversations a constant reminder of surveillance, you realize that these castrated men represent the harem's ultimate tragedy. They're victims who've become perpetrators, prisoners who've accepted their chains so completely that they now forge new ones for others, living proof that the Ottoman system could break anyone completely if it applied enough pressure in precisely the right places. You enter a world where death wears silk gloves and speaks in whispered endearments, where the most beautiful women become the most accomplished poisoners, and where survival depends on mastering the delicate art of elimination without leaving fingerprints. The harem transforms into a laboratory of lethal creativity, where desperate mothers and ambitious concubines turn everyday objects into weapons of assassination that would make professional killers envious of their ingenuity and ruthlessness. The poison trade thrives in the shadows of the women's quarters, conducted through networks that would rival any intelligence operation. Trusted servants smuggle rare substances from across the empire, arsenic from European mines, exotic plant extracts from African traders, deadly compounds derived from Mediterranean sea creatures. The most prized toxins come from the palace gardens themselves, where innocent-looking flowers and herbs conceal chemical warfare capabilities that transform dinner parties into potential massacre sites. You learn to recognize the subtle signs of poisoning attempts in your daily life. That unusually bitter taste in your morning tea might be more than poor preparation. The servant who insists on serving you personally despite having no previous interest in your welfare could be delivering death with a smile. Even your cosmetics become suspect. Some poisons absorb through skin, making your daily beauty routine a potential suicide ritual if rivals have tampered with your makeup supplies. The most sophisticated assassinations unfold over months, using compounds that accumulate slowly in the victim's system before delivering fatal results that appear completely natural. A rival mother might slip tiny doses of mercury into your food for weeks, causing gradual hair loss, tooth decay, and mental confusion that physicians would attribute to natural illness rather than deliberate murder. The beauty of slow poisoning lies in its deniability. By the time symptoms appear, the trail back to the perpetrator has grown cold as winter streams. Alliances form around shared survival needs, creating temporary partnerships between women who understand that cooperation might be their only defense against more powerful enemies. You might find yourself in whispered conversations with other concubines, sharing information about suspicious servants or unusual illnesses that could indicate poisoning campaigns. These alliances shift constantly as pregnancies, successions, and imperial favour rearrange the hierarchy of threats and opportunities. The Valida Sultan often orchestrates the most elaborate schemes, using her position to access rare poisons and coordinate complex elimination campaigns that might target multiple victims simultaneously. Her personal physicians become accomplices in medical murder, prescribing treatments that worsen conditions rather than cure them, or simply reporting natural deaths for women who died from very unnatural causes. The Empire's most powerful woman wields chemistry like a weapon of mass destruction. Historians still argue whether palace poisoning was as widespread as contemporary accounts suggest, or merely reflected the paranoid atmosphere of imperial courts. But from your perspective, the constant threat of chemical assassination shapes every decision you make about what to eat, drink, or touch. Countermeasures become as important as offensive capabilities in this toxic environment. You learn to employ food tasters, usually lower-ranking servants whose deaths would be regrettable but not catastrophic. Silver utensils supposedly detect certain poisons by changing colour, though clever assassins have learned to use compounds that don't react with precious metals. Some women develop elaborate rituals around meal preparation, insisting on watching their food being cooked and served by people whose loyalty has been tested through years of faithful service. The psychological warfare extends beyond actual poisoning into rumour campaigns designed to destroy reputations and isolate targets. A woman might find herself accused of poisoning others even when she's completely innocent, her denials interpreted as proof of guilt by rivals who understand that perception often matters more than reality in the harem's echo chamber of gossip and suspicion. The mere suggestion of involvement in poisoning attempts can lead to social exile that makes actual murder unnecessary. Some of the most creative assassination attempts involve environmental manipulation rather than direct poisoning. Toxic substances might be introduced into a victim's bathwater, painted onto door handles she'll touch, or woven into fabrics that release deadly compounds when worn against warm skin. The boundaries between accident and intention become deliberately blurred, giving successful assassins plausible deniability while still achieving their lethal objectives. The irony of harem poisoning lies in how it transforms the empire's most pampered women into its most dangerous killers. These delicate flowers who spend hours perfecting their beauty become masters of death, their soft hands capable of mixing compounds that could eliminate entire bloodlines. The same intelligence that makes them fascinating conversationalists also makes them formidable opponents in chemical warfare that leaves no obvious evidence behind. As you carefully examine tonight's dinner before taking your first bite, testing each dish with silver instruments while watching for suspicious behaviours among the servants, you realise that the harem has transformed basic survival into an advanced course in paranoid chemistry, where every meal could be your last and every friend might be mixing your epitaph in a crystal vial hidden beneath silk robes. You live in absolute terror of the one woman who holds the power to order your death with the same casual authority she might use to request tea. The valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, rules the harem like an empress commanding her own empire, her word carrying more weight than laws written by emperors, and her displeasure spelling doom more certain than any court sentence. She moves through the women's quarters like a force of nature, her presence announced by the rustling of expensive silk and the sudden silence of hundreds of women who understand that their lives depend entirely on her continuing goodwill. Her power stems from the most intimate relationship in the empire, the bond between a mother and the son who rules 3 continents. Unlike wives who might be divorced or concubines who could fall from favour, the valide Sultan's position remains unshakable as long as her son lives. This gives her influence that transcends official government structures, making her effectively the second most powerful person in the Ottoman Empire and certainly the most dangerous individual in your immediate universe. You witness her authority in the daily administration of harem justice, where she serves as judge, jury and executioner for crimes both real and imagined. A concubine who shows insufficient respect might find herself reassigned to the palace kitchens, her dreams of imperial motherhood replaced by a lifetime of scrubbing pots. More serious offences, real or perceived threats to the imperial succession, result in disappearances that everyone understands but no one dares discuss openly. Her surveillance network rivals any intelligence service, with informants planted among every level of the harem hierarchy. Servants report conversations they've overheard, while higher-ranking concubines compete to bring her useful information about their rivals' activities. You learn to assume that everything you say will eventually reach her ears, editing your words and even your thoughts to avoid saying anything that might be construed as disloyal or threatening to the established order. The valide Sultan's personal history often reads like a catalogue of survival horror. She's usually a woman who climbed from the lowest ranks through a combination of beauty, intelligence, and ruthless determination that eliminated countless competitors along the way. Her own experiences in the harem's brutal hierarchy have taught her exactly which pressure points cause the most pain and which methods of control prove most effective. She understands the system's cruelties because she's both suffered and inflicted them. Her relationship with her own son creates complicated dynamics that affect every woman in the harem. She might orchestrate the selection of his concubines, choosing women who pose no threat to her continued influence, while eliminating those who might challenge her authority. Some Valide sultans have been accused of poisoning their sons' favourite consorts, preferring a grieving but controllable ruler to one who might transfer his affections from mother to wife. Historians still argue whether Valide sultans were powerful political figures in their own right, or merely extensions of their sons' authority. But from your perspective, the distinction is meaningless when her decisions determine whether you live or die. The most terrifying aspect of her power is its unpredictability. A Valide sultan might show unexpected mercy to someone who deserves punishment, or order brutal retribution for seemingly minor offences. Her moods can shift like weather patterns, influenced by factors you can't predict or control. Letters from governors describing provincial rebellions, reports of her son's health problems, or simply the natural irritability that comes with aging in a position where everyone wants something from you. Your interactions with her are carefully choreographed rituals where every gesture carries meaning, and any mistake could prove fatal. When she enters a room, you prostrate yourself with the precise timing and angle that demonstrates respect without appearing theatrical. Your responses to her questions must balance honesty with the diplomatic skills necessary to survive in a court where truth can be more dangerous than lies. She controls access to her son, deciding which women receive imperial attention and which remain invisible in the harem's lower ranks. A single word from her can elevate an odalisque to Kadin status, or reduce a favoured consort to servitude. This power over romantic and reproductive opportunities makes her the ultimate arbiter of every woman's destiny in the palace, wielding sexuality and motherhood as tools for maintaining imperial stability. The Valide Sultan's living quarters reflect her extraordinary status apartments, decorated with treasures from across the known world. Servants who've been trained in skills that most people couldn't imagine. Luxuries that demonstrate the empire's wealth, while reminding everyone of the vast distance between her position and theirs. Yet even in this splendour, you sense the paranoia that comes with absolute power, the constant vigilance required to maintain authority that depends entirely on one person's continued life and loyalty. Her legacy often involves the systematic elimination of threats to her son's reign, including the orchestration of fratricide that eliminates potential rival claimants to the throne. She becomes the architect of family murder, justifying infanticide as necessary for imperial stability, while personally ordering the deaths of her own grandchildren when political necessity demands such sacrifices. As you lie awake tonight, knowing that your fate rests in the hands of a woman whose word could end your life before sunrise, you understand that the Valide Sultan represents the harem's ultimate paradox: absolute feminine power exercised in service of masculine authority, creating a system where women achieve unprecedented influence by becoming enthusiastic participants in their own systematic oppression. You watch in horror as women who once commanded armies of servants gradually fade into invisible spectres haunting the palace corridors, their beauty consumed by time and their value evaporated like morning mist in the harsh light of imperial pragmatism. In the Ottoman Harem, aging is not a natural process but a death sentence carried out in slow motion, where every wrinkle becomes evidence of your declining worth and every grey hair marks another step toward complete irrelevance in a system that worships youth above all other virtues. The mathematics of abandonment are brutally simple. The empire invests enormous resources in training and maintaining concubines only as long as they remain sexually desirable and reproductively viable. Once nature begins its inevitable work of aging, those investments are redirected toward younger women who represent fresh possibilities for imperial pleasure and dynastic continuation. Your transformation from precious asset to unwanted burden happens gradually, then suddenly, like bankruptcy or death itself. The signs of your approaching obsolescence accumulate with terrifying subtlety. Perhaps the Sultan's glances linger on you for shorter periods during his visits to the harem, or maybe the quality of your assigned clothing begins declining as palace administrators redirect the finest fabrics toward newer arrivals. Your servants might start showing less deference, sensing the shift in your status like animals detecting earthquakes before humans notice the ground trembling beneath their feet. Former favourites often cling desperately to memories of their golden years, decorating their increasingly modest quarters with portraits and jewellery from times when they mattered to someone powerful. You encounter women in their 40s and 50s who still rouge their cheeks and perfume their hair with the same care they showed at 18, refusing to acknowledge that their audience has moved on to appreciate younger performers in the eternal theatre of imperial desire. The empire provides several disposal methods for women who've outlived their usefulness, none of them particularly appealing to the discarded concubines themselves. The luckiest might be married off to provincial governors or military commanders who receive them as rewards for loyal service, essentially being gifted like fine horses or expensive carpets to men who understand their value as symbols of imperial favour rather than as individual human beings. Others find themselves reassigned to menial duties within the palace complex, their days of silk and poetry replaced by endless hours of laundry, cooking, or cleaning the same rooms where they once reclined in luxury. The psychological torture of this demotion often proves more devastating than physical hardship. Watching younger women enjoy privileges you once took for granted while you scrub floors and empty chamber pots creates a special category of despair reserved for those who've fallen from great heights. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman system's treatment of aging concubines was more or less cruel than European practices of simply abandoning unwanted mistresses, but you experience it as a form of living death that makes actual mortality seem almost merciful by comparison. The most tragic cases involve women who attempt to maintain their relevance through increasingly desperate measures. Some resort to dangerous cosmetic procedures using mercury-based compounds that promise to restore youthful complexions while slowly poisoning their users. Others seek out questionable physicians who claim to possess elixirs of youth, spending their life savings on treatments that typically accelerate the aging process they're meant to reverse. Exile represents the final solution for women who've become completely superfluous to imperial needs. These discarded concubines receive small pensions and housing in distant cities, far enough from the capital to ensure they can't embarrass the empire with visible evidence of its callous treatment of loyal servants. Many exile themselves voluntarily, understanding that remaining in the palace means watching their former world continue without them, while being reminded daily of their irrelevance. The few women who successfully navigate the transition from concubine to elder often do so by developing alternative sources of value within the palace ecosystem. Some become teachers for newer arrivals, trading their accumulated knowledge of harem politics for continued relevance. Others establish themselves as informal advisors to younger women, offering strategic counsel in exchange for protection and support from those still climbing the hierarchy they've fallen from. The psychological preparation for obsolescence becomes a survival skill that some women master better than others. Those who accept their declining status gracefully often fare better than those who fight against inevitable change, understanding that dignity in defeat sometimes preserves more options than desperate attempts to reclaim lost youth and beauty. Religious devotion provides another escape route for aging concubines, offering them the possibility of finding meaning beyond imperial service while preparing for whatever existence awaits after their palace years end. Some women discover genuine spiritual comfort in Islamic practices, while others simply use religion as socially acceptable camouflage for their grief over lost relevance and faded dreams. As you examine your reflection tonight, searching for the new lines around your eyes while trying to calculate how many more years of desirability you might reasonably expect, you realize that the harem has taught you to measure your life's worth through other people's desire, creating a system where aging becomes not just physical decline, but existential catastrophe for women who've never learned to value themselves independently of male attention. You discover that desperation can transform even the most carefully guarded women into revolutionaries, their silk-clad rebellion erupting like hidden volcanoes when survival instincts finally overcome years of conditioning designed to keep them compliant. The harem's history conceals stories of women who refuse to accept their gilded cages gracefully, staging escapes, revolts, and acts of defiance that challenged the Ottoman Empire's assumption that beautiful prisoners would remain forever grateful for their luxurious captivity. The most famous rebellion erupted in 1648 when concubines coordinated a palace uprising that nearly toppled Sultan Ibrahim's reign, their feminine fury unleashed after years of witnessing his increasingly erratic behavior and brutal treatment of women who failed to please him. You can almost hear the echo of their footsteps as hundreds of women moved through corridors they'd walked submissively for years, this time carrying kitchen knives and garden tools transformed into weapons of liberation by hands that had been taught only to caress and serve. Escape attempts require planning that would impress military strategists, complicated by the fact that most concubines have been isolated from the outside world for so long that they lack practical knowledge of geography, currency, or social customs beyond palace walls. Some women spend years secretly learning Turkish dialects spoken in distant provinces, believing that linguistic camouflage might help them disappear into populations that wouldn't recognize their imperial training and refined mannerisms. The network of servants, eunuchs, and minor officials who enable these escape attempts creates an underground economy of rebellion where loyalty can be purchased with jewelry, sexual favors, or promises of rewards if the escapees successfully reach freedom. You learn to identify potential allies among the palace staff by watching for subtle signs of dissatisfaction, a lingering glance at the gates, unusual questions about life outside the walls, or expressions of sympathy for women who've been punished for previous infractions. The most elaborate escape schemes involve disguises that transform imperial concubines into servants, merchants, or even men if they're brave enough to attempt gender deception. Some women bind their breasts and cut their hair, learning masculine mannerisms from observing eunuch guards, while practicing deeper voices in secret locations where they won't be overheard. The irony is sharp. Women trained to epitomize femininity must reject everything that makes them valuable to the empire in order to escape its control. Religious pilgrimage provides another avenue for potential escape, as some concubines convince authorities to allow them to visit sacred sites outside the palace. These spiritual journeys offer opportunities to disappear into crowds of worshippers, though success requires abandoning the Islamic faith that justified their pilgrimage in the first place. The psychological complexity of using religion to escape religious captivity creates moral dilemmas that add another layer of difficulty to already dangerous plans. Historians still argue whether harem rebellions were genuine liberation movements or simply expressions of frustrated privilege. But from your perspective, the distinction matters less than the courage required to risk execution for the possibility of freedom. The punishment for failed escape attempts is designed to discourage future rebellions through examples that combine public humiliation with private torture. Captured escapees might be displayed in the palace courtyards, their torn clothing and obvious terror serving as object lessons for other women who might consider similar adventures. The most defiant rebels face execution by strangulation, their deaths carried out with the same silk bowstrings used to eliminate surplus princes. Some women attempt escape through suicide, viewing death as the ultimate liberation from a system that has consumed their humanity while preserving their bodies for imperial use. These final acts of defiance often involve elaborate staging designed to embarrass the empire, jumping from palace walls during public ceremonies, poisoning themselves with compounds stolen from the same networks used to eliminate rivals, or setting fire to their quarters in ways that threatened to spread throughout the harem complex. The few successful escapees who managed to disappear into the empire's vast territories face challenges that make their palace captivity seem almost comfortable by comparison. Without family connections, financial resources, or practical skills for surviving outside aristocratic circles, many former concubines end up in situations that are arguably worse than their original imprisonment. Some become prostitutes, others fall victim to slavers who recognize their value and return them to captivity, while a fortunate few manage to create new identities in distant provinces where their imperial past remains secret. The knowledge of successful escapes spreads through the harem like wildfire, carried in whispered conversations that transform desperate women into potential conspirators. Even rumours of liberation inspire others to attempt their own escapes, creating cycles of rebellion that force palace authorities to increase security measures that make life more restrictive for everyone remaining behind. Collective resistance sometimes takes subtler forms than outright rebellion, manifesting as coordinated work slowdowns, synchronized illnesses that disrupt palace routines, or mass refusals to participate in entertainment programs designed to display the harem's beauty to visiting dignitaries. These passive-aggressive campaigns demonstrate solidarity among women who understand that individual escape attempts rarely succeed, but collective action might create conditions for systematic change. As you lie awake planning your own potential escape route while listening to the night sounds of guards making their rounds, you realize that rebellion in the harem isn't just about physical freedom. It's about reclaiming the human dignity that the Ottoman system has spent years systematically destroying, proving to yourself and others that even the most perfectly crafted prison can't completely eliminate the soul's desire for liberation. You live in constant proximity to death, wearing 1,000 different masks, from the plague that sweeps through crowded quarters like an invisible army, to the childbirth that transforms your greatest hope into your most likely executioner. The harem's marble halls echo with more than footsteps and whispered conversations. They carry the sound of coughing that won't stop, the silence that follows difficult labour, and the prayers of women who understand that their beautiful prison might also become their ornate tomb. The plague arrives in Constantinople with terrifying regularity, carried by merchant ships and military campaigns that connect the Ottoman Empire to every corner of the known world. When the Black Death enters the harem, your luxurious quarters become a death trap where close living conditions ensure that disease spreads faster than wildfire through dry grass. You watch women who dance gracefully, just days before now, struggling to breathe, their silk-covered bodies burning with fever while palace physicians apply treatments that seem more like torture than healing. The medical care available to concubines reveals the empire's twisted priorities. Enormous resources are invested in maintaining your beauty and fertility, while actual healthcare remains primitive by any reasonable standard. Palace physicians rely on bloodletting, mercury treatments, and herbal compounds that often cause more harm than the original illnesses. You endure procedures that would horrify modern observers, all administered by men whose medical training consists primarily of memorized texts rather than practical understanding of human anatomy. Childbirth becomes your greatest gamble with death, where the very biological function that could elevate your status to Kadin Effendi might instead deliver you to an unmarked grave in the palace cemetery. The mortality rates during delivery are staggering, even by medieval standards. Palace records suggest that nearly 30% of harem births resulted in maternal death, often from complications that skilled midwives might have prevented if they'd been allowed to develop expertise through broader practice, rather than the secretive restrictions of imperial service. The psychological torture of knowing these statistics affects every pregnancy in the harem, transforming what should be joyful anticipation into months of terror punctuated by moments of desperate hope. You calculate odds like a gambler betting your life, understanding that each child you attempt to bear represents another roll of dice where losing means leaving your other children motherless, while winning might require surviving delivery only to watch your newborn die from complications that palace medicine can't address. Suicide represents another form of death that stalks the harem corridors, though palace officials work hard to disguise these tragedies as natural deaths or accidents to avoid admitting that their paradise might drive women to choose death over continued captivity. You learn to recognize the warning signs in women whose despair has reached critical levels. The too bright smiles that don't reach dead eyes, the sudden generosity of women giving away possessions they'll no longer need, the conversations that sound like farewells disguised as casual chat. Historians still argue whether harem suicide rates exceeded those in comparable populations, but from your perspective, the question misses the point when you're watching friends disappear into darkness that palace luxury can't illuminate. The food-related illnesses that plague the harem result from the complex supply chains required to feed hundreds of women with imported delicacies that spoil during long journeys from distant provinces. You develop sophisticated strategies for detecting contaminated food, learning to identify the subtle signs of spoilage in exotic fruits and spices that your taste buds weren't designed to evaluate. The irony burns like poison. You're surrounded by the world's finest cuisine while constantly risking death from the very luxuries that demonstrate your elevated status. Epidemic diseases spread through the servant networks that connect the harem to the outside world, carried by laundresses, cooks, and maintenance workers who have contact with the broader palace population. Typhoid, dysentery, and mysterious fevers sweep through the women's quarters periodically, killing indiscriminately while palace physicians struggle to understand transmission patterns that won't be properly explained for another few centuries. The psychological stress of constant mortality creates its own health problems, as women's immune systems weaken under the burden of perpetual anxiety. You watch previously healthy concubines develop mysterious ailments that seem to have no physical cause beyond the crushing weight of living in an environment where death lurks behind every silk curtain and beneath every flower petal in the palace gardens. Some women attempt to control their medical fate through folk remedies and superstitions imported from their homelands, creating underground networks of traditional healing that supplement or replace official palace medicine. These informal medical systems sometimes prove more effective than the physician's treatments, though practicing them risks punishment for introducing foreign customs into the imperial household. The disposal of bodies becomes a logistical challenge that reveals the empire's attitude toward concubine mortality. Deceased women are buried in unmarked graves outside the palace walls, their deaths recorded in administrative ledgers like any other inventory loss. No ceremonies mark their passing, no monuments preserve their memory, no family members receive notification of their deaths because the empire has already severed those connections years earlier. As you lie in your narrow bed listening to the sound of someone coughing in the distance, wondering if it's the beginning of another epidemic that might claim dozens of lives before running its course, you realize that the harem has surrounded you with every luxury except the one that matters most. The reasonable expectation of survival that most human beings take for granted until it's stripped away by circumstances beyond their control. You discover that surviving one sultan's reign only prepares you for the ultimate betrayal that awaits when his successor takes the throne, bringing with him a new vision of imperial pleasure that rarely includes accommodating his predecessor's collection of aging concubines. The transition between rulers transforms the harem from your familiar prison into a slaughterhouse, where yesterday's favourites become today's liabilities, eliminated to make room for fresh blood and younger bodies that haven't been contaminated by association with the previous regime. The Ottoman tradition of fratricide ensures that new sultans ascend to power through violence, having eliminated their brothers to secure undisputed succession. This bloodbath creates rulers who understand that mercy can be interpreted as weakness, making them particularly ruthless when dealing with potential complications inherited from their predecessors. Your very existence represents a connection to the old order that must be severed to establish the new sultan's absolute authority over every aspect of imperial life. The purge begins within days of the new sultan's coronation, as eunuch administrators compile lists of women who pose potential threats to the emerging power structure. Former Kadin Effendi who bore children to the deceased sultan face immediate elimination because their sons represent alternative claims to the throne. Your maternal status, once your greatest protection, now marks you for death as surely as if you were wearing a target painted on your silk robes. The methods of elimination vary depending on the new sultan's personality and political calculations, but the results remain consistently fatal regardless of the specific technique employed. Some rulers prefer mass executions carried out efficiently with silk bowstrings, disposing of dozens of women in a single night of systematic murder that clears the harem for complete restocking. Others choose slower approaches, allowing former concubines to die gradually through poison, neglect, or carefully orchestrated accidents that maintain plausible deniability. The new sultan's mother, the incoming Valide Sultan, often orchestrates these purges with the methodical thoroughness of someone cleaning house before hosting important guests. She understands that eliminating her predecessors' women prevents future complications, while demonstrating her own authority over the reconstituted harem hierarchy. Her orders transform the corridors where you've lived for years into hunting grounds where survival depends on remaining invisible until the killing spree exhausts itself. Some concubines attempt to survive through desperate appeals to the new sultan's mercy, offering their services as teachers for incoming women or promising to share intelligence about the previous regime's secrets and weaknesses. These negotiations rarely succeed because new rulers typically prefer starting with completely clean slates, rather than risking contamination from women whose loyalties might remain divided between past and present masters. Historians still argue whether these succession purges were driven by political necessity or simply represented the casual cruelty of absolute power. But from your perspective, the motivation matters less than the certain knowledge that your death has been scheduled to accommodate someone else's convenience. The few women who escape elimination often do so through connections that transcend the harem's boundaries, perhaps a brother who's achieved high rank in the military, or a father whose provincial governorship provides enough leverage to negotiate his daughter's survival. These fortunate survivors usually find themselves married off to distant officials, their imperial experience transformed into diplomatic currency that purchases safety at the cost of exile from everything they've known. The incoming concubines who replace the murdered women arrive to find quarters still bearing traces of their predecessors' presence. Forgotten jewellery hidden in secret compartments, love letters tucked behind loose tiles, children's toys left by mothers who died before they could retrieve these precious remnants of lives that ended without warning. These ghostly reminders create an atmosphere of unease that new arrivals struggle to ignore while settling into rooms where previous occupants met violent ends. The psychological impact on survivors creates lasting trauma that affects every aspect of harem life during the new reign. Women who witness the purges develop hypervigilance and paranoia that makes normal relationships nearly impossible, understanding that their current safety depends entirely on the continued goodwill of a ruler who's already demonstrated his willingness to eliminate human obstacles to his comfort and convenience. The administrative efficiency of these transitions reveals the Ottoman Empire's institutional approach to mass murder, with detailed procedures for disposing of bodies, redistributing possessions, and reassigning quarters that suggest these purges were routine business rather than exceptional events. Palace bureaucrats handle genocide with the same careful attention to detail they might apply to any other logistical challenge. The economic implications of succession purges demonstrate the empire's treatment of concubines as disposable assets whose value depreciates to zero the moment political circumstances change. Years of investment in training, housing, and maintaining hundreds of women are written off as acceptable losses when new rulers decide to start fresh rather than inherit the complexities of established harem relationships. As you huddle in your quarters tonight, listening for the footsteps that might announce your own execution while wondering if tomorrow's dawn will find you among the living or the dead, you realize that the harem has taught you the ultimate lesson about absolute power. Even perfect submission and devoted service provide no protection against rulers who prefer the convenience of genocide to the complications of gratitude. You stand in corridors that once echoed with the rustle of silk and the whispered dreams of hundreds of women, now haunted by shadows that speak louder than voices ever did. The great harem of the Ottoman Empire has begun its final transformation, from living prison to museum of sorrows, its marble floors bearing the invisible stains of tears shed by generations of women whose names history refused to remember. The empire that once stretched across 3 continents is crumbling, and with it dies the system that transformed human beings into ornamental objects for imperial pleasure. The last concubines move through these spaces like ghosts of their own past lives, their silk robes faded, but their stories still burning with the intensity of wounds that never quite healed. You can almost hear their conversations drifting through the empty chambers, reminiscences about sisters lost to childbirth, mothers murdered during succession struggles, daughters sold to prevent them from experiencing their mother's fate. Each woman carries within her body the accumulated trauma of a system that consumed innocence as fuel for masculine power fantasies. The photographs that European visitors began taking in the harem's final decades reveal faces that seem to stare directly through time, their eyes holding knowledge that photographers couldn't capture with their primitive equipment. These women had learned to perform beauty while harbouring souls that had been systematically destroyed and rebuilt, in service of men who saw them as interchangeable ornaments in their personal collections. Their smiles in these historic images carry messages that viewers still struggle to decode more than a century later. The architectural remnants tell their own stories to anyone willing to listen carefully. Those intricate geometric patterns carved into window frames weren't just decorative. They were the mathematical expression of a worldview that reduced human complexity to repeating designs that could be controlled, predicted, and replaced when necessary. The fountains that once provided soothing background music for whispered conversations now seem to weep with the accumulated sorrow of women who found their reflections in the water and wondered if drowning might provide the escape that rebellion never could. The economic calculations that justified the harem system reveal the cold mathematics of treating human beings as capital investments with depreciation schedules measured in years of beauty and fertility. Palace ledgers record the costs of maintaining hundreds of women with the same precision applied to military equipment or architectural projects, suggesting that imperial accountants saw no meaningful distinction between human assets and material possessions when calculating returns on imperial expenditures. The medical records that survive from the harem's later years document gynecological examinations that sound more like livestock inspections than healthcare, with physicians noting reproductive capacity and physical condition in clinical language that strips away any acknowledgement of the patient's humanity. These women's bodies became state property so completely that even their most intimate biological functions were monitored, measured, and managed by bureaucrats, who filed reports about menstrual cycles like crop yields or mineral production statistics. Historians still argue whether the harem system was uniquely cruel or simply reflected broader patterns of gender oppression that characterized most historical societies, but the specific combination of luxury and brutality created psychological damage that transcended individual suffering to become a form of cultural trauma that affected entire generations. The testimonies of women who survived the harem's final dissolution describe liberation that felt more like death than freedom, as they struggled to adapt to a world that had continued evolving while they remained frozen in imperial time. Many former concubines never learned to make independent decisions, having spent their adult lives in systems where choice was an illusion carefully maintained to disguise complete powerlessness. Their freedom became another form of prison when they discovered that decades of captivity had destroyed their capacity for autonomous existence. The children born in the harem carried forward psychological patterns that affected families for generations, as mothers who had learned to compete with other women for survival taught their daughters to measure their worth through male attention, while viewing other females as potential threats rather than allies. The empire's gender dynamics outlived the political system that created them, embedding themselves in cultural practices that continued long after the harem gates finally opened permanently. The paradox of the harem's historical legacy lies in how it simultaneously elevated women to unprecedented levels of luxury, while reducing them to objects for consumption by imperial power structures. Some concubines achieved influence that rivaled cabinet ministers, controlling vast financial networks and making decisions that affected millions of people. Yet they exercised this power only as extensions of masculine authority, rather than independent agents capable of defining their own destinies. The silence that surrounds the harem's dissolution mirrors the silence that characterized the women's lives within its walls. A quiet that spoke more eloquently than words could about suffering that exceeded language's capacity for description. The empire simply stopped maintaining the system, allowing it to fade away like a bad dream that loses its power when exposed to daylight, leaving behind only architectural remnants and the occasional memoir that hints at experiences too devastating for complete revelation. As the sun sets over the Bosphorus for the final time on this particular form of institutionalized cruelty, the empty chambers seem to exhale centuries of held breath, releasing spirits that were imprisoned not just by walls, but by a civilization that convinced itself that beauty justified barbarity and luxury, excused the systematic destruction of human dignity. The great harem dies not with dramatic collapse, but with the whispered recognition that some forms of paradise are indistinguishable from hell when examined closely enough to see the blood beneath the silk. Underscore 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 underscore. The marble grows cold beneath your feet as you walk these corridors one final time, your footsteps joining the eternal echo of women who came before and will come after in different forms but similar circumstances. The empire that created this golden cage has taught you that power always finds new ways to dress brutality in beautiful clothes, that luxury can disguise the most profound forms of human degradation, and that the greatest tragedies often occur in the most beautiful settings. You've learned that survival sometimes requires becoming something less than human while retaining just enough humanity to remember what you've lost. The harem's greatest cruelty wasn't the physical imprisonment, but the psychological conditioning that taught you to be grateful for your captivity, to compete with other victims rather than resist your oppressors, and to measure your worth through the attention of people who saw you as disposable ornaments in their personal collections. Yet, in the end, even the most perfect prison eventually crumbles, and even the most systematic oppression ultimately fails because the human spirit, no matter how carefully crushed and reshaped, retains some irreducible core that refuses to be completely destroyed. The women who survived these marble corridors carried within them not just trauma, but also the fierce knowledge that they had endured what seemed unendurable, transforming their suffering into a form of wisdom that no empire could conquer or claim as its own property. Sleep well tonight, knowing that the ghosts of the Ottoman Harem have finally been allowed to rest, their stories told and their suffering acknowledged by a world that has learned to recognize beauty that conceals brutality, and to question any paradise that requires some people to sacrifice their humanity so others can enjoy lives of uncomplicated luxury.